The rain lashed mercilessly across the open prairie, turning the already muddy trail into a treacherous quagmire as Thomas Morgan urged his horse forward through the downpour. It was the kind of rain that soaked a man to his bones in seconds, the kind that made even the most seasoned cowboys seek shelter. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving Wyoming Territory showed no mercy to those caught in its elements. Thomas pulled his sodden hat lower, squinting through the curtain of water when something caught his eye, a figure standing motionless by the side of the trail. As he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. There, drenched and shivering, stood a woman. Not just any woman, but one heavy with child, her hands cradling her swollen belly protectively as the storm raged around her. He reined in his horse, Rusty, who snorted and stamped impatiently. The woman's face was pale, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. She couldn't have been more than 25, with eyes that reminded Thomas of a frightened doe. "Madam," he called out over the howling wind, "you'll catch your death out here." She looked up at him, desperation etched across her features. Her dress, once fine but now mud-spattered and torn at the hem, clung to her pregnant form. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm, "I need help." Without hesitation, Thomas dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He removed his duster coat and draped it around her trembling shoulders. "Name's Thomas Morgan," he said, tipping his dripping hat. "Most folks just call me Tom." "Willow," she replied through chattering teeth. "Willow Granger." Thomas glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the woman before him. "You'll be dry before nightfall, Miss Granger. That's a promise." He helped her onto Rusty, noting how she winced as she settled into the saddle. Thomas took the reins and began leading the horse toward his homestead, which thankfully was just a few miles ahead. The rain continued its assault, but Thomas walked steadily, occasionally glancing back to ensure Willow was still secure on the horse. "How did you end up out here alone?" he asked, raising his voice above the storm. Willow's hands tightened around the saddle horn. "I was traveling on the stagecoach to Wilcox. There was trouble, bandits. The coach overturned. I managed to get away, but I've been walking for hours." Thomas frowned. "The Wilcox-bound stage wasn't due through these parts until tomorrow." "The Wilcox stage ain't due till Thursday, madam." A look of confusion crossed her face. "Thursday? But the ticket agent in Cheyenne said Tuesday." "Might have been a private coach then," Thomas conceded, though something didn't sit right. Private coaches were rare in these parts, and bandits usually targeted the regular routes where the pickings were more predictable. As they trudged along, the rain began to ease slightly, allowing Thomas to make out his modest homestead in the distance. It wasn't much, a sturdy log cabin with a small barn and corral, but it was home, and right now, it represented salvation for the pregnant woman who'd appeared on the trail like a ghost. "Almost there," he encouraged, noticing how Willow seemed to be sagging in the saddle, her strength clearly waning. By the time they reached the cabin, the rain had subsided to a gentle patter. Thomas helped Willow down from Rusty, alarmed at how light she felt despite her condition. She swayed on her feet, and he steadied her with a firm but gentle hand. "Easy now," he murmured, guiding her toward the cabin door. "Let's get you inside." The interior of the cabin was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a rough-hewn table and two chairs positioned nearby. A bed was tucked into one corner, and various supplies lined shelves along the walls. Thomas quickly set about building a fire while Willow stood dripping on the plank floor, still wrapped in his oversized duster. "You should get out of those wet clothes," he said, keeping his eyes averted out of respect. "I'll find something dry for you to wear." He rummaged through a trunk and produced a clean flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. They would be far too large for her, but they were dry. He also pulled out a blanket. "They ain't fancy, but they'll keep you warm. I'll step outside while you change." Willow accepted the clothes with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Just Thomas, or Tom if you prefer. Mr. Morgan was my father, and he's been gone some years now." Outside, Thomas tended to Rusty, removing the saddle and brushing down the tired horse. His mind raced with questions about the mysterious woman. Something about her story didn't add up, but she was clearly in distress, and that was enough for him to offer help. After giving Willow ample time to change, Thomas knocked on the door. "It's safe to come in," she called out. When he entered, he found her seated close to the fire, his clothes hanging comically large on her frame. Her wet dress and undergarments had been draped over a chair to dry. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was a dignity about her that struck Thomas. Her face, now illuminated by the firelight, revealed delicate features framed by damp, dark hair that was beginning to curl as it dried. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving to a small pantry area. "Starving," she admitted, a hint of embarrassment coloring her voice. Thomas nodded and set about preparing a simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits left from that morning. As he worked, he observed Willow from the corner of his eye. She sat with her hands protectively cradling her belly, eyes fixed on the dancing flames of the fire. "How far along are you?" he ventured, placing a cast iron skillet over the fire. "Nearly 8 months, I believe," she replied softly, and the father, a shadow crossed her face. "Dead." Thomas didn't press further. The West was full of widows, women left to fend for themselves after disease, accidents, or violence claimed their husbands. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the cabin roof. Willow ate ravenously, confirming Thomas's suspicion that she hadn't had a proper meal in some time. "You mentioned you were heading to Wilcox," Thomas said as he collected their empty plates. "Do you have family there?" Willow hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the oversized sleeve of his shirt. "Not exactly, I was hoping to find work." "Work in your condition?" "I don't have many choices, Thomas," she replied, a hint of steel entering her voice for the first time. "I need to provide for my child." Thomas studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes despite her exhausted state. "Wilcox is still a good 3 days' ride from here, and that's in fair weather. With the rains we've been having, the creek might be too swollen to cross safely." Willow's shoulders slumped slightly. "I see." "You're welcome to stay here until the weather clears," Thomas offered. "It ain't much, but it's dry and safe." Gratitude flooded her features. "You're very kind to a stranger." Thomas shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "Out here, folks need to look out for each other. The land don't forgive those who turn their backs on someone in need." As night fell, Thomas made up a pallet for himself near the fire, insisting that Willow take the bed. Despite her protests, he was firm. "I've slept under the stars in all sorts of weather, madam." A floor with a roof overhead is luxury by comparison. Lying on his makeshift bed, Thomas listened to the steady rhythm of Willow's breathing across the room. He had many questions about her, but they could wait until morning. For now, she was safe and dry, just as he'd promised. The night passed peacefully, but Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit. He moved quietly so as not to disturb his guest and slipped outside to tend to his animals. The storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed landscape that glistened in the early morning light. When he returned to the cabin, he found Willow awake and attempting to fold the blankets on the bed. "You don't need to do that," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "I want to earn my keep," she replied, wincing slightly as she straightened up. Thomas frowned. "Are you in pain?" "Just the usual discomforts," she assured him, though the tightness around her eyes suggested otherwise. Thomas wasn't convinced but decided not to press the issue. "I'll fix us some breakfast, and then we can figure out what to do about getting you to Wilcox." As they ate a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with molasses, Thomas noticed Willow kept glancing out the window toward the trail. "Expecting someone?" he asked casually. She startled slightly. "No, just wondering about the weather." "It's cleared up nice, but the trails will be muddy for a spell," he observed. "Mind if I ask what kind of work you're looking for in Wilcox?" Willow pushed her food around her bowl. "Anything respectable. I can sew, cook, clean. I was a school teacher back east before." Her voice trailed off. "Before what?" Thomas prompted gently. She met his gaze directly, a challenge in her eyes. "Before I made mistakes that cost me everything." The frankness of her answer surprised him. Most women in her position would have concocted some socially acceptable tale about a dead husband and unfortunate circumstances. "We all make mistakes," Thomas said after a moment. "It's what we do after that counts." A small smile touched her lips. "That's a kind way to look at it." After breakfast, Thomas suggested they ride into the small settlement a few miles away to check on the conditions of the trails to Wilcox. Willow agreed, though she seemed nervous at the prospect of venturing out. Thomas helped her onto Rusty once again, then mounted behind her. Having her this close was unsettling in a way he hadn't expected. It had been years since he'd been this near to a woman, and the scent of her hair clean now from washing with his lye soap brought back memories he'd long suppressed. The settlement of Pine Creek wasn't much more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of scattered buildings that served the ranchers and homesteaders in the area. As they rode in, Thomas felt Willow tense in front of him. "Something wrong?" he asked quietly. "No," she replied too quickly. "It's just been a while since I've been around people." Thomas dismounted and helped her down, noticing how she positioned herself so that her pregnant belly was less obvious beneath his large coat, which she still wore. Inside the general store, the proprietor, Walter Jenkins, greeted Thomas warmly. "Tom Morgan, ain't seen you in these parts for a spell, and who might this lovely lady be?" "This is Miss Granger," Thomas said simply, not elaborating on how they'd come to be traveling together. "We're wondering about the trail conditions to Wilcox." Walter's bushy eyebrows rose. "Wilcox, you'd be better off waiting a week or more. Heard tell the bridge over Carson Creek washed out in the storm. They're working on it, but with more rain in the forecast." Thomas nodded, secretly relieved. The delay would give Willow time to rest and perhaps reveal more about her situation. As Walter gathered the supplies Thomas requested, the door to the store opened and two men entered. They wore the dust of the trail, and their eyes narrowed as they surveyed the store's occupants. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Walter greeted them. "What can I help you with?" The taller of the two men ignored the shopkeeper, his gaze fixed on Willow. "Well, well, ain't this a pleasant surprise?" Willow's face drained of color, and she instinctively stepped closer to Thomas. "Do you know these men?" Thomas asked quietly. "They worked for my husband," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The man took a step forward. "Mrs. Blackburn, your brother-in-law's been mighty worried about you, sent us to find you and bring you home." Thomas felt a jolt of confusion. "Blackburn? She'd given her name as Granger. I'm not going back," Willow stated, her voice stronger than Thomas would have expected given her obvious fear. The second man spoke up. "Now, Mrs. Blackburn, that ain't your choice to make. Mr. Blackburn's got legal rights to you and that baby you're carrying, his brother's child and all." Thomas moved slightly, positioning himself between Willow and the men. "The lady says she's not going with you." The first man's hand drifted toward his gun. "This ain't your business, Cowboy." Walter Jenkins cleared his throat loudly. "No trouble in my store, gentlemen. I've got a scattergun under this counter that don't care who it hits." A tense silence fell over the room. Finally, the first man sneered. "We'll be in town a spell. Think about it, Mrs. Blackburn. You know Mr. Edward won't stop looking for you." The men backed out of the store, their eyes never leaving Willow. Once they were gone, Thomas turned to her. "You've got some explaining to do." Willow's eyes were filled with tears. "I'm sorry for lying, but I was afraid. If I'd told you the truth, you might have turned me away." Thomas paid Walter for the supplies and guided Willow back outside. The men were nowhere in sight, but Thomas knew they wouldn't have gone far. "We need to get back to the cabin," he said, helping her onto Rusty. "Then you're going to tell me everything." The ride back was tense and silent. Thomas kept a watchful eye on the trail behind them, but there was no sign of pursuit. When they reached the cabin, he quickly unloaded the supplies and secured the door. Willow sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know where to begin." "Start with your real name," Thomas suggested, his voice firm but not unkind. "My name is Willow, but it's Willow Blackburn, not Granger. Granger was my maiden name," she began. "I was married to James Blackburn, a wealthy rancher from Colorado. He wasn't a kind man." Thomas remained silent, allowing her to continue. "James died 3 months ago. His brother Edward took control of everything. According to James's will, if I was with child, the baby would inherit everything, with Edward as guardian until the child comes of age." Willow's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Edward made it clear that once the baby was born, I would no longer be necessary." "You think he means to harm you?" Thomas asked, his expression grave. Willow nodded. "I overheard him talking with his foreman. They planned to make it look like complications from childbirth. No one would question it, so you ran." "Yes, I took what little money I had saved and fled. I've been traveling for weeks, staying in one place for only a day or two before moving on. I was trying to reach Wilcox because I'd heard there's a women's aid society there." Thomas paced the small cabin, considering what she'd told him. If her story was true, she was in genuine danger. But there was also the matter of the law. Edward Blackburn might have legal rights, as distasteful as that seemed. "Those men will be coming," he said finally. "They know you're with me now, and Pine Creek ain't that big. Someone will point them to my place." Fear flickered across Willow's face. "I've put you in danger. I'm so sorry, Thomas." He waved away her apology. "Don't fret about that. I've faced worse odds." He considered their options. "We can't go to Wilcox now. They'll be watching the trails, and you're in no condition to be running through the wilderness. What can we do?" she asked, desperation edging into her voice. Thomas made a decision. "We'll stay here and prepare. If they come, we'll be ready. I've got friends in these parts who will stand with us if needed." As evening approached, Thomas moved around the cabin, checking his rifles and pistols, making sure they were clean and loaded. Willow watched him with growing concern. "I can't ask you to fight for me," she said softly. Thomas paused in his preparations. "You didn't ask, I'm offering." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas considered it for a moment. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because no woman should have to fear for her life or her child's." That night they took turns keeping watch. Thomas insisted Willow rest as much as possible, knowing that stress wasn't good for her or the baby. When she finally fell into an uneasy sleep, he sat by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit clearing around the cabin. His mind turned over the events of the past 2 days. He'd gone from a solitary existence to harboring a fugitive pregnant woman in the span of hours. Part of him wondered if he was being foolish, risking everything for a stranger whose story might not even be true. But when he looked at Willow's face, peaceful in sleep despite the fear that had haunted her eyes while awake, he knew he couldn't have done otherwise. The next morning brought no sign of the men from town, but Thomas remained vigilant. After breakfast, he suggested they ride to his nearest neighbor, an old friend named Samuel Wilson who lived about 5 miles away. "Sam's got a wife who might be able to help you better than I can," Thomas explained. "And if trouble comes, having more guns won't hurt." They reached the Wilson homestead by mid-morning. Samuel's wife, Martha, took one look at Willow and immediately ushered her inside, clucking with concern over her condition. Thomas explained the situation to Samuel, who nodded gravely. "Edward Blackburn has a reputation even this far from Colorado. They say he's as mean as a rattler and twice as deadly." "You believe her story, then?" Thomas asked. Samuel shrugged. "Martha will get to the truth of it. She's got a sense about people. But whether it's all true or not, a woman in her condition deserves protection." Inside the house, Martha had settled Willow in a comfortable chair and was examining her with practiced hands. "How long have you been having pains?" Martha asked, her expression concerned. Willow looked surprised. "Just the usual discomfort." Martha shook her head. "These aren't usual, dear. Your body's preparing for birth. I'd say you're closer to term than you thought." Thomas and Samuel entered in time to hear this pronouncement. Thomas felt a surge of panic. He knew nothing about birthing babies. "Is it coming now?" he asked, unable to keep the alarm from his voice. Martha chuckled. "Not just yet, but soon. Within a week, I'd wager. She shouldn't be traveling anywhere." Samuel clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "Looks like you've got yourself quite a situation, my friend." Before Thomas could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Samuel moved to the window and peered out cautiously. "4 riders," he reported. "Don't recognize them, but they look like trouble." Thomas joined him at the window. Sure enough, the 2 men from the store were there, along with 2 others who had the hard look of hired guns. "They must have followed our trail," Thomas muttered. "I was careless." Samuel reached for his rifle. "We've got the advantage of position. Martha, take Willow to the back room." Martha guided Willow away, whispering reassurances. Thomas could see the fear on Willow's face, but there was determination there too. The riders stopped a respectful distance from the house. The leader, the same tall man from the store, called out, "We know you're in there, Mrs. Blackburn." "Mr. Edward just wants to talk." Samuel looked to Thomas. "What do you want to do?" Thomas considered their options. A direct confrontation could end badly for everyone. "Let me talk to them. Maybe there's a peaceful solution." Samuel didn't look convinced but nodded. Thomas stepped onto the porch, making sure to stay partially shielded by the doorframe. He kept his hand near his pistol. "Mrs. Blackburn is not available for talking," he called out. "She's made her wishes clear." The leader scowled. "This ain't about what she wants." Mr. Edward has legal rights to that baby she's carrying. The law's on our side." "The law doesn't give him the right to threaten her life," Thomas countered. The man's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Cowboy. Mr. Edward is a respected businessman." "Then let him come make his case in person. Until then, the lady stays with us." The four men conferred briefly. Finally, the leader nodded. "We'll be back with the sheriff. This ain't over." They turned their horses and rode away, dust billowing behind them. Samuel exhaled slowly. "That buys us some time, but not much. The sheriff in these parts is Jed Lawson. He's a fair man, but he'll uphold the law as he sees it." Thomas nodded grimly. "Then we need to find a way to prove Willow's claims about Edward's intentions." They returned inside to find Martha and Willow in the kitchen. Willow's face was pale, but she seemed calmer. "What happens now?" she asked. "They're going for the sheriff," Thomas informed her. "We need evidence of Edward's threats against you." Willow's expression fell. "It was just words I overheard, nothing written." Martha patted her hand. "Don't worry, dear. God has a way of revealing the truth." They spent the day preparing for whatever might come. Samuel sent his oldest son to alert other neighbors about the situation, knowing that the community would stand together against outside threats. Martha checked her medical supplies, anticipating that Willow might go into labor at any time. Thomas found himself watching Willow throughout the day, noticing the grace with which she moved despite her condition. The gentle way she spoke with Martha's children, the flash of intelligence in her eyes when they discussed their options. He was drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected, and it unsettled him. That evening, as they sat around the Wilsons' table for supper, the sound of approaching horses once again disrupted their peace. This time when Samuel checked the window, his expression was grim. "It's Sheriff Lawson, all right, and he's got those four men with him plus one more fancy-dressed fellow. Probably Edward Blackburn himself." Willow's hand flew to her throat. "Edward," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. Thomas stood. "Samuel, keep everyone inside. I'll handle this." He stepped onto the porch just as Sheriff Lawson dismounted. Lawson was a weathered man in his 50s with a reputation for fairness that had earned him respect throughout the territory. "Evening, Thomas," the sheriff greeted him. "Seems we've got ourselves a situation here." Thomas nodded. "Evening, Sheriff. I take it these gentlemen have been bending your ear." The well-dressed man stepped forward. He was tall and lean, with cold eyes and a meticulously groomed appearance that seemed out of place on the frontier. "I'm Edward Blackburn," he announced, his voice cultured but with an underlying hardness. "You're harboring my sister-in-law who has fled with my unborn nephew or niece. I demand her return immediately." Sheriff Lawson held up a hand. "Now, Mr. Blackburn, we're going to handle this properly." "Thomas, is Mrs. Blackburn inside?" "She is, Sheriff, and she's under our protection." "She fled Mr. Blackburn because she fears for her life and that of her child." Edward scoffed. "Preposterous. Willow has been unstable since my brother's death. Grief has affected her mind. I've only sought to care for her and ensure my brother's child receives the inheritance that is rightfully theirs." Sheriff Lawson considered this. "I'll need to speak with Mrs. Blackburn directly." Thomas hesitated but knew he couldn't refuse the sheriff. "She's resting. Martha Wilson says the baby could come any day now." "All the more reason she should be with family," Edward insisted. "I've brought a doctor from Cheyenne to attend her." Thomas glanced at the group of men but saw no one who looked like a physician. Edward noticed his skepticism. "He's waiting in town. I didn't want to overwhelm Willow with too many faces at once." Sheriff Lawson sighed. "Thomas, I understand your concerns, but Mr. Blackburn does have legal standing here. Let me speak with Mrs. Blackburn and we'll sort this out." Thomas reluctantly stepped aside to allow the sheriff entry. Edward moved to follow, but Thomas blocked his path. "Just the sheriff." Edward's face darkened, but Sheriff Lawson nodded in agreement. "That's fair. Wait here, Mr. Blackburn." Inside, they found Willow sitting in the kitchen with Martha. She looked up, fear evident in her eyes when she saw the sheriff. "Mrs. Blackburn," Sheriff Lawson began gently, "your brother-in-law is outside. He claims you've left his protection without cause, and that he has legal rights regarding your unborn child." Willow straightened, summoning her courage. "Sheriff, Edward plans to kill me once the baby is born. I overheard him discussing it with his foreman. He wants control of my child and the inheritance that comes with it." The sheriff frowned. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof?" Only what I heard with my own ears, Willow admitted. But I know my brother-in-law, my husband James, was a cruel man, but Edward is worse. He hides it better, but there's a coldness in him that terrifies me. Sheriff Lawson looked troubled. Without evidence, Mrs. Blackburn, I'm in a difficult position. The law recognizes Mr. Blackburn's guardianship claims. Thomas, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. What if someone from town could verify her claims? Someone who knows Edward Blackburn's character. The sheriff considered this. That might help, but who? Willow suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Martha was at her side instantly. The baby? Thomas asked, alarmed. Martha placed her hand on Willow's stomach, feeling the contraction. It's starting, but it's early yet. First babies often take their time. Sheriff Lawson looked uncomfortable, as most men did at the prospect of childbirth. Perhaps this discussion should wait. No, Willow said firmly, though her face was pale with pain. Sheriff, please, I can't go with Edward. I beg you to give us time to find evidence. The sheriff hesitated, clearly torn. The law is the law, Mrs. Blackburn, but I won't force a woman in labor to travel. You can stay here until the baby comes. After that, we'll revisit the matter. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was a temporary reprieve at best. The sheriff returned outside to convey his decision to Edward Blackburn. Through the window, Thomas could see the man's face contort with rage, though he quickly composed himself. The argument continued for several minutes before Edward finally mounted his horse and rode away with his men, but not before casting a dark look toward the house. He'll be back, Samuel said, watching them go, and he won't be pleasant about it. Thomas nodded grimly. We need to find proof of his intentions before the baby arrives. Over the next 2 days, Willow's labor progressed slowly. Martha assured them this was normal for a first child, but Thomas couldn't help feeling anxious. He found himself pacing outside the room where Willow rested between contractions, feeling helpless yet unwilling to leave her. During one of the quieter periods, Thomas sat beside Willow's bed, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth as Martha had shown him. Why are you doing all this for me? Willow asked softly. You barely know me. Thomas considered the question. I'm not sure I can explain it properly. When I found you in that rain, something told me you needed more than just shelter, and now. He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. And now, she prompted. Now I can't imagine not helping you, he finished simply, Willow's eyes filled with tears. I've never known a man like you, Thomas Morgan. My husband saw me as property and Edward sees me as an obstacle, but you see me. Thomas felt something shift in his heart, a barrier breaking down that he'd built after years of solitude. Before he could respond, Willow's face contorted in pain as another contraction seized her. Martha hurried in, shooing Thomas away. It's getting closer now. You men make yourselves useful elsewhere. Thomas reluctantly left, joining Samuel outside where they kept watch for any sign of Edward's return. As the day wore on, they discussed possibilities for proving Willow's claims. What about Edward's foreman? Thomas suggested. If he was part of the conversation Willow overheard, he might be convinced to talk. Samuel looked doubtful. Men loyal to someone like Blackburn aren't easily turned. Unless they have more to lose by staying loyal, Thomas mused. We need to find out more about this foreman. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a rider, a young man named Daniel Collins who worked at the general store in Pine Creek. Mr. Morgan, Daniel called out breathlessly as he dismounted. Mr. Jenkins sent me to find you, said it was urgent. Thomas approached him quickly. What is it, Daniel? There's a man in town asking questions about Edward Blackburn. Says he's a lawman from Colorado. Mr. Jenkins thought you'd want to know. Thomas and Samuel exchanged surprised glances. Did this lawman say why he's looking for Blackburn? Daniel shook his head. No, sir, but he seemed mighty interested when Mr. Jenkins mentioned that Blackburn's men were in these parts. Where's this lawman now? Thomas asked. Still at the store, I reckon. Mr. Jenkins was fixing to offer him a meal. Thomas made a quick decision. Samuel, I need to go into town. Will you keep watch here? Samuel nodded. Go, this might be the break we need. Thomas saddled Rusty and rode hard for Pine Creek, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this lawman be the answer to their prayers, or was it another of Edward's tricks? When he reached the general store, Thomas entered cautiously. Walter Jenkins was behind the counter, chatting with a man whose back was to the door. The stranger wore a dusty black coat and had a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Walter looked up. "Ah, Thomas, that was quick. This here is Marshal Wyatt Bennett from Denver." The marshal turned, revealing a weathered face with keen eyes that assessed Thomas quickly. "Mr. Morgan, Walter here says you might know something about Edward Blackburn's whereabouts." Thomas approached, still wary. "Before I answer that, Marshal, I'd like to know why you're looking for him." Marshal Bennett smiled slightly. "Cautious man, I respect that." He pulled out a folded paper from his coat. "I have a warrant for Edward Blackburn's arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and suspected murder of his brother, James Blackburn." Thomas felt a surge of hope. "Murder? You have evidence." The Blackburn family doctor became suspicious about James's sudden illness and preserved samples. Tests showed arsenic poisoning. The marshal's expression was grim. "We've also discovered that Edward has been systematically looting the Blackburn estate for months. When Mrs. Blackburn disappeared, it raised further questions." "Willow," Thomas said, "she's with me. Or rather, she's at a friend's farm. She fled because she overheard Edward planning to kill her after her baby was born." The marshal nodded. "That fits with what we've learned. Edward stands to control the entire Blackburn fortune if he can get custody of that child. Where is she now?" "In labor," Thomas replied. "The baby's coming and Edward knows it. He brought the sheriff out yesterday trying to claim her." Marshal Bennett's expression hardened. "Then we need to move quickly. Is Edward in town?" "He was staying at the saloon, last I heard, him and 4 men." The marshal considered this information. "I'll need help taking them. Edward won't come quietly and his men are hired guns." Walter Jenkins, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "I can round up some of the local boys, Marshal. Folks around here stand with Thomas." The marshal nodded appreciatively. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get. Mr. Morgan, you should get back to Mrs. Blackburn. Edward might decide to take matters into his own hands if he gets desperate." Thomas agreed, relief and worry warring within him. As he mounted Rusty to return to the Wilson farm, he couldn't help but feel that they were approaching a reckoning. One way or another, Willow's future would be decided soon. The ride back seemed interminable, even though Thomas pushed Rusty harder than usual. When the Wilson farm finally came into view, Thomas felt his heart skip at the sight of extra horses in the yard, horses he didn't recognize. He approached cautiously, dismounting some distance away and drawing his pistol before moving closer on foot. The house appeared quiet, but Thomas's instincts screamed danger. He circled around to the back, where a small window allowed him to peer into the kitchen. What he saw made his blood run cold. Samuel and his son were seated at the table, hands bound behind their backs. One of Edward's men stood guard over them, rifle in hand. Thomas moved to another window, trying to get a view of the rest of the house. Through the parlor window, he could see Martha, also bound, sitting on the sofa. Of Willow and Edward, there was no sign, but Thomas could hear raised voices from deeper in the house. He needed to act quickly but carefully. Rushing in would put everyone at risk. Thomas retreated to the barn, where he found Samuel's youngest son, 10-year-old Liam, hiding in the hayloft. "Liam," Thomas whispered urgently. "What happened?" The boy's eyes were wide with fear. "They came about an hour ago, Mr. Blackburn and 3 men. They tied up Pa and Mark and Mrs. Wilson. Mr. Blackburn went to Miss Willow's room." "How many men are in the house?" 3. "One with Pa and Mark, one with Ma, and one with Mr. Blackburn." Thomas nodded, formulating a plan. "Liam, I need you to be brave. Can you ride?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Take the back trail to Pine Creek. Find Marshal Bennett at the general store or the saloon. Tell him Edward Blackburn is here and holding everyone prisoner." "Can you do that?" Liam straightened his shoulders. "Yes, sir." Thomas helped the boy mount one of the gentler horses from the barn and sent him off down the back trail. Then he turned his attention to the house. He needed a distraction. Moving to the far side of the property, Thomas set fire to a small stack of hay well away from any structures. As the flames began to rise, he positioned himself near the back door of the house. It didn't take long for one of Edward's men to notice the fire. The back door opened and a burly man stepped out, squinting at the distant flames. "What the hell?" he muttered, taking a step forward. Thomas struck quickly, bringing the butt of his pistol down hard on the back of the man's head. The hired gun crumpled without a sound. Thomas dragged him behind a rain barrel and bound his hands with the man's own belt. One down, two to go. Thomas slipped into the house through the back door, finding himself in the kitchen. Samuel and his son looked up in surprise, their eyes widening in recognition. The guard had his back to Thomas, still watching out the front window where he could see the distant fire. Thomas moved silently across the kitchen floor. When he was close enough, he pressed his pistol against the guard's back. "Don't move," he whispered. "Drop the rifle." The man tensed but did as instructed. Thomas quickly knocked him unconscious with a blow to the head, then untied Samuel and Mark. "Edwards with Willow?" Thomas asked urgently. Samuel nodded, rubbing his wrists. "In the back bedroom, one more guard with them." "Martha." "Parlor with the third man." Thomas handed Samuel the unconscious guard's rifle. "Free Martha, I'm going for Willow." Thomas moved quietly down the hallway toward the back bedroom. As he drew closer, he could hear voices, Edward's cultured tones, sharp with anger, and Willow's responses, weaker but defiant. "The child is coming today, Willow. You've caused me enough trouble. Once the baby is born, we're leaving immediately." "I won't let you take my child." Willow's voice was strained, likely from contractions. "You don't have a choice. As the child's uncle and legal guardian, you killed James," Willow accused. "I know you did." A silence fell, then Edward laughed coldly. "Clever girl, I wondered if you suspected." "Yes, I helped my dear brother along to his reward. He was mismanaging the family fortune, making poor investments. It was for the best, really. And now you'll kill me too. Let's just say complications in childbirth are tragically common, especially in these primitive conditions." Thomas had heard enough. He kicked the door open, pistol raised. Edward Blackburn stood at the foot of the bed where Willow lay, her face contorted in pain. The third guard was by the window, but he reacted quickly, drawing his gun. Thomas fired first, catching the guard in the shoulder. The man cried out and dropped his weapon. Edward, however, was faster than Thomas had anticipated. He drew a small derringer from his coat pocket and aimed it at Willow. "Drop your gun, cowboy, or she dies right now." Thomas froze, his pistol still raised. "You won't shoot her, Edward." "Not until the baby's born." Edward's smile was cold. "True, but I can certainly ensure she doesn't survive the birth. Now drop the gun." Thomas hesitated, calculating his options. Before he could decide, Willow let out a cry as another contraction seized her. In that moment of distraction, Edward turned his derringer toward Thomas. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Edward's gun. The well-dressed man staggered, a look of shock on his face as blood blossomed on his chest. He fell to his knees, the derringer clattering to the floor. Thomas turned to see Martha Wilson in the doorway, a small pistol in her hand. Her face was pale but determined. "No one threatens a woman in my home," she said firmly. Edward collapsed, gasping for breath. Thomas quickly secured the wounded guard, then checked Edward. The bullet had struck near his heart. He wouldn't survive long. "You've lost, Edward," Thomas told him. Edward's eyes were already glazing over. "She was never supposed to get away." His voice trailed off as the life left his body. Thomas turned his attention to Willow, who was breathing heavily, sweat beading on her forehead. Martha rushed to her side. "The baby's coming now," Martha announced. "Thomas, get some hot water and clean linens, and get that body out of here." Samuel appeared at the door, taking in the scene with a grim expression. He helped Thomas remove Edward's body and the wounded guard, who was now unconscious from blood loss. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Marshal Bennett arrived with a posse from town, having met Liam on the trail. They secured the remaining hired guns, and the marshal took charge of Edward's body, expressing regret that he couldn't bring the man to justice, but satisfaction that Willow was now safe. Thomas paced outside the bedroom door as Willow's labor intensified. The sounds of her pain tore at his heart, but Martha assured him that everything was progressing normally. As the sun began to set, a new sound filled the house, the lusty cry of a newborn. Thomas froze, his heart hammering in his chest. A few minutes later, Martha opened the door, her tired face wreathed in smiles. "Come meet your son, Mrs. Blackburn," she called over her shoulder, then gestured for Thomas to enter. Willow lay propped up on pillows, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a clean blanket. She looked up as Thomas approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. "Thomas," she whispered, "meet William James Blackburn." Thomas moved to her side, gazing down at the red-faced infant who had caused so much trouble before he'd even entered the world. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features. "He's beautiful," Thomas said softly, "just like his mother." Willow's eyes filled with tears. "We're safe now, aren't we?" "Yes," Thomas assured her. Marshal Bennett explained everything. "Edward's crimes have been proven. The Blackburn estate will be held in trust for your son until he comes of age. You're his guardian now, with no one to challenge that right." Relief washed over Willow's face. "I don't know how to thank you, Thomas. You saved us both." Thomas took her hand gently. "You don't need to thank me. He paused, suddenly uncertain of what to say. The feelings that had been growing in him since he found her in the rain were strong, but was it too soon to speak of them? Willow seemed to understand his hesitation. "It's all right, Thomas. We have time now." In the days that followed, Thomas remained at the Wilson farm, helping where he could as Willow recovered from childbirth. Little William proved to be a healthy, strong baby with a good appetite and lungs to match. Thomas found himself fascinated by the tiny being, watching in wonder as Willow cared for him with a natural grace that belied her inexperience. A week after William's birth, Marshal Bennett returned with news. Edward's crimes had been fully documented, and the Blackburn estate was indeed secure for William. Moreover, Edward's hired men had turned on each other, with the wounded guard providing a full confession in exchange for leniency. "Mrs. Blackburn," the marshal said, "you're now a very wealthy woman as the trustee of your son's inheritance. You can return to Colorado whenever you're ready or establish yourself elsewhere if you prefer." Willow glanced at Thomas, who had been standing quietly by the window. "I'm not sure what I'll do yet, Marshal, but I won't be returning to the Blackburn ranch. Too many painful memories there." That evening, as Willow sat on the porch with William sleeping in her arms, Thomas joined her. The summer twilight was peaceful, with fireflies beginning to dance in the gathering darkness. "Marshal Bennett says you're free to leave whenever you wish," Thomas said after a moment of companionable silence. "Yes," Willow replied softly, "but I'm not sure where to go." Thomas took a deep breath. "You could stay. Here in Wyoming, I mean." Willow looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "And where would I stay, Thomas Morgan?" It was the moment of truth, and Thomas found his usual confidence wavering. "With me, if you wanted to. My cabin's small, but it could be expanded, and there's good land around it for raising cattle and children." A slow smile spread across Willow's face. "Are you asking me something, Thomas?" He nodded, finding his courage. "I know it's been a whirlwind, and maybe I'm speaking too soon. But when I found you in that rain, something changed for me. I'd been alone so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to care for someone else, to want to protect them, to see them smile, to build a future together." Willow's free hand reached for his. "It's not too soon, Thomas. Life in the West doesn't always allow for lengthy courtships. Sometimes you just know." "And do you know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do," she replied simply. "You saw me when I was at my most vulnerable, and you offered help without expecting anything in return. You risked your life for me and my son. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you said I'd be dry before nightfall." Thomas smiled at the memory. "I wasn't expecting to find a pregnant woman on the trail that day, let alone one who would change my life." "Life has a way of surprising us," Willow said, looking down at her sleeping son. "William needs a father, Thomas, a real one, not the monster James was." "I'd be honored to be his father," Thomas said earnestly, "and your husband if you'll have me." Willow's answer was to lean forward and press her lips gently against his. It was a brief kiss, sweet and full of promise, but it sealed a bond that had been forming since that rainy afternoon on the trail. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Thomas and Willow were married in a simple ceremony at the church in Pine Creek. William, growing stronger every day, was cradled in Martha Wilson's arms as the couple exchanged their vows. The entire community turned out to celebrate, touched by the romance of their story, which had already become something of a local legend. With Willow's inheritance, they were able to purchase additional land surrounding Thomas's homestead and begin building a proper ranch. Thomas insisted that the money be primarily saved for William's future, but Willow was equally insistent that their present comfort was important too. "My son will learn the value of work," she declared as they discussed plans for the ranch. but he'll also know security and love, which is worth more than any inheritance. As winter settled over the Wyoming Territory, the Morgan Ranch stood as a beacon of warmth and hope. The cabin had been expanded into a comfortable home with room for their family to grow. Thomas proved to be a natural father, doting on little William as if he were his own blood. On a snowy evening in December, as they sat before the fire with William sleeping in his cradle nearby, Willow rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. "Do you ever think about that day in the rain?" she asked. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't come along when you did." Thomas wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I try not to think of what might have been, only what is and what will be." "And what will be, Thomas Morgan?" he smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "More children if we're blessed, a prosperous ranch, watching William grow into a fine young man, growing old with you by my side." Willow sighed contentedly. "It sounds perfect." "It won't always be," Thomas said honestly. "The West is still wild and life can be hard, but we'll face it together." "Together," Willow agreed. "That's all I ever wanted, someone to stand with me through whatever comes." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their land in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting a golden glow over the family that had been forged through chance, courage, and love. From that rainy day on the trail to this peaceful winter night, their journey had been unexpected but ultimately perfect in its own way. "I love you, Willow Morgan," Thomas whispered. "And I love you," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss. "My cowboy who promised I'd be dry before nightfall." As the years passed, the Morgan Ranch flourished, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. William grew into a strong, kind young man with his mother's intelligence and his adoptive father's quiet strength. He was joined by two siblings, a sister, Elizabeth, born a year after Thomas and Willow's wedding, and a brother, Samuel, who arrived 2 years later. Thomas and Willow's love story became the stuff of local legend, told and retold around campfires and at community gatherings. The tale of the cowboy who found a pregnant woman standing in the rain and promised she'd be dry before nightfall became a testament to the unexpected ways love could be found even in the harsh realities of the frontier. And on rainy days, even decades later, Thomas would wink at Willow across the room, a private reminder of the storm that had brought them together and the sunshine they'd found in each other's arms.